Excerpts from Reading Part 2. I liked the other videos so much that I decided I'm going to continue doing this. This book is something that I finished earlier this year. I've read it before, but it's one of the books that I read every year. It very much reminds me of the man that I need to be and the man that I want to be. It is written by a man named Louis Albert Banks. It is called The Christian Gentleman. Not super long. You can also find this online, PDF. I'll link it in the description below. There is a way to listen to it audibly for those that hate reading. And I don't know why you hate reading. It's fantastic. But so for anyone wanting a print copy, this particular version is by Funk and Wagnalls Company, printed in 1898. I don't recommend the original versions. There are reprints that people have been making lately that are about to be $30 to $50. The originals can be upwards of 80. I thankfully got this and a few others for less than their full price at the time. About 2-3 years ago, each first or second edition was about $150 minimum. In recent years, they have dropped a little bit. I'm not entirely sure why. I have some theories, given that a lot of the buyers happened to be from a certain ministry, and that ministry has taken a hit recently. What happened to my light? Oh, there's a cat in the window. Oh. Nope, okay. And so because there's less buyers, now the sellers are having to drop their prices. Just something you notice after buying books for so long. The content of this book, particularly, as it says in the title, The Christian Gentleman, essentially is how a man should be if they are a Christian. And so I'm going to pull from, I believe this is chapter 2, yes. It is titled The Christian Gentleman in the Secret Chambers of His Imagination. I'm not going to read the entire chapter. That would take way too long. But I will read about a third to a half, as it's just solidly awesome. Our subject is difficult because it belongs to the realm of the unseen and spiritual, whose priceless values are not easily measured. It is easy to weigh and measure gross material things. It is easy to tell what they will do under a given set of conditions. It is not hard to compute the force of a waterfall like the Niagara. Easily within human power to draw off a portion of it, as has recently been done, and harnessed it down to the work of civilization, estimate just how many spindles it will turn, how many canal boats it will drive, how many cars it will speed on their way, or how many towns 100 miles distant it will light. Given the weight of a cannonball and the number of ounces of powder exploded behind it in the gun barrel, and it is easy to tell through how many miles of space it will be hurled, and how much destructive power it will have when it strikes. But when we undertake to weigh love, or hope, or fear, or ambition, or fancy, it is more difficult. Who could have foretold how much vitality there would be left in David's shepherd psalm after being thrown across a chasm of 40 centuries? Who could have prophesied the unabated vital force of the conversation which Jesus held with the fishermen of Galilee after 1850 years had come and gone? Nothing seems so elusive when we try to measure it as the imagination, and yet it is the creative element in the mind in every sort of constructive work, whether of the mathematician, the inventor, the explorer, the poet, the painter, or the prophet of religion. Herbert Spencer says that rightly conceived imagination is the power of mental representation, and is measured by the vividness and truth of this representation. End quote. A little reflection will convince anyone that the imagination is the chief fortress of the human mind, and must be reckoned with first of all, after the body itself, in the building up of a strong character. The imagination is often strong enough to overcome all surrounding circumstances, and cause a man to live as though they were not. It is related of Emerson that he was walking down School Street in Boston on the day set by the Millerites for the end of the world. A friend met him and remarked, "Do you know, Mr. Emerson, that they say the world is to be done away with at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Emerson looked thoughtful for a moment, and then replied with philosophic composure, "We can do very well without it." The imagination can give to a poor man all the sensations of wealth. A young French writer had occasion to visit the great Paris publisher, Charpentier. He found him engaged with a gentleman who was a stranger to himself. "Yes, my dear Charpentier," said the stranger, "it is going to be a complete surprise to my mother. She doesn't know a thing about it. You see, the chateau and grounds are laid out in this way." And then the stranger proceeded to trace a map of the grounds of a splendid estate. He pointed out where the house was to be built and entered into the most elaborate details of architecture, the adornment, and the furnishings. The poor man of letters, as he listened, felt the greatest admiration and envy at the nonchalant way in which this stranger talked of such a lavish expenditure of money. After a while, when the talker went away with his grand air, the younger man ventured to ask, "Who was that gentleman?" "That was Balzac," said Charpentier. "Balzac? Why, he must be making a great deal of money out of his novels." The publisher smiled. "What do you suppose was his business with me just now? It was to get me to advance him 500 francs on his next volume, which isn't written yet, to pay his board bill. The imagination can make a well man ill. A friend of mine, a distinguished clergyman, who has the reputation of being remarkably cool-headed, thought on one occasion that he noticed in himself some traces of palpitation of the heart. A day or two after this he went to a distant town to attend a convention which was to last several days. He was entertained in a private family, and had scarcely lain down on his bed in his room the first evening when he was astonished that the palpitation of his heart seemed to be worse than he had ever noted before. He felt that the bed moved every time his heart beat. He said to himself that he must be getting in a very bad condition when the throbbing of his heart shook the bed like that. Being a man of very determined will, he turned over on his side, forced himself to think about something else, and went to sleep. He awoke about 2 o'clock in the morning, and to his dismay found the bed shaking again at every beat of his heart. This both surprised and alarmed him, for up to this time he had always found his heart regular and composed when awakening from a deep slumber. He was so greatly disturbed by it that he finally arose and dressed, and busied himself in writing until morning. On going down to breakfast, his hostess inquired as to how he had rested. He replied that he had slept only fairly well, as was usually the case with him on spending the first night in a strange place. She remarked that she was fearful he would be disturbed by an electric light plant situated on the next block, which caused the beds to shake in every house in that neighborhood. It is needless to say that my friend saw no further traces of palpitation of the heart during the remainder of the convention. On the other hand, the imagination is often the source of healing to a sick man. Many people who visit Denver 2 or 3 years ago, and after shaking hands with a hitherto unknown cobbler, came away to enjoy better health, are examples of the power of the imagination, an insane imagination on the part of the cobbler, and a morbid and credulous imagination on their own part. The power of the imagination may be illustrated from every side. Rossiter Johnson has recently said that the best talkers are those who talk imaginatively. He does not mean by those who draw the long bow in conversation, but those who tell the truth imaginatively. Certainly we know there is no such teacher in the great realm of human nature as fiction. Its power must rest in the fact that men felt intuitively that the man or woman portrayed imaginatively by the great artist in fiction is more near the true, real personality than we can discover in any other way. Take those wonderful Scotch stories of Ian Maclaren's In Beside the Bonnie Briar Bush and Auld Lang Syne. The whole civilized world has been laughing and crying over these Scotchmen in the Highland Glen. Their attraction is we see them in a halo, a glow of warm imagination. I suppose that if we were to hunt the glens through which we would never recognize with our poor outward vision such women as Margaret, such doctors as William McClure, and such worldly wise saints as Drumsay. And yet no doubt Maclaren has given us the truest portraits of Highlanders that have as yet been made. Many an old Scot, reading these word pictures, has been ready to cry out, "God knows I want to be just a man as that." History often finds vivid recital in the same way. General O. O. Howard once remarked to me that in his judgment the truest history of the War of Rebellion would be in the great works of fiction that would someday appear portraying those tragic events. Sin entered into this world through the imagination. Whether you take the book of Genesis to be a literal history of what occurred or a figurative portrayal, it will still teach you the same lesson, that through the imagination sin gained the citadel of the human heart. The serpent called Eve's attention to the beautiful fruit that ripened on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. His appeal to her was infinitely seductive. He promised that if she should eat it, she would become wise as God himself. All mysteries would be unraveled, and she would know the why and wherefore of all things. Certainly nothing could be more tempting to a perfect creation, a feminine creation such as Eve was, than this lying prophecy of the serpent. I'll go ahead and read the entire thing. The imagination is today their fortress of evil. This is true in the financial world. The greatest perils that are born of a greedy imagination, the wildest dreams of fiction, are not more marvelous than some of the actual swindling schemes men dream out under an unbridled fancy. A discovery a few months ago of the origin of certain counterfeit silver dollars is an illustration to this point. Counterfeit silver dollars suddenly appeared which, unlike most counterfeits, were made of genuine silver. Indeed, they were discovered because they had more silver in them than the regular government dollar. Ouch. When this came about, two government detectives remembered an incident which had occurred in San Francisco 2 or 3 years before. These men were in a liquor saloon in that city one evening and overheard a conversation of a group of men on the subject of counterfeiting. One of this group was an old miner from Montana who said that it was a wonder to him that somebody hadn't thought of the scheme of taking advantage of the low price of silver bullion to make counterfeit dollars out of real silver, as it was possible to make a fortune out of it and there would be no way of detecting the cheat. These detectives reasoned that the man who had thought of this scheme 2 years was probably the man who, after dreaming over it and letting it burn in his imagination, had actually set the work to do it. They set themselves to hunt down the old miner, and sure enough, in finding him, they located the head counterfeiter. The beginning of all sin is like that. Its source is in the imagination, and many sins are committed there that never have outward incarnation of the deeds. Some strange passages of Scripture become clear as day in the light of this discussion. Take that saying of James that a man who hates his brother is a murderer, and the one of Jesus that a class who hate another circle of their fellow beings are whited sepulchres, full of dead men's bones, and see how when you bring them together in the light of the importance of the imagination they fit into one another. A great many men commit murder in their imagination and incur its guilt, who never have a chance to do it with their own hands. They used to say of some desperado out on the frontier, he keeps a private graveyard of his own, having reference to the victims of his murderous lawlessness. But in the light of our own theme, we can see how many outwardly decorous, and it may be professedly Christian, men and women who sit in church pews keeping a private graveyard of their own. Down deep in their secret chambers of imagination lie bleaching the bones of the men and women whom they have slain. No wonder some men have a surly expression, a sour and sarcastic and moldy smell to their conversation. They are walking graveyards. Paul declares that it is the mission of Jesus Christ to capture this stronghold of the imagination. He says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but mighty before God, to the casting down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that is exalted against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ." According to this, a man is not truly a Christian gentleman until his imagination has been fully captured by Jesus Christ. It is not only what a man does, but what he wants to do, what in his secret heart he dreams of accomplishing. There are many thieves whose hands never steal, many adulterers whose deeds never violate the law of chastity, many murderers who never shoot or stab or poison. These men are kept outwardly honest and chaste and law-abiding because of the fear of consequences. The true way to judge ourselves is to ask the heart-searching question, what would I do if all outward laws, whether of the statute book or of social fear of my fellow man, were completely withdrawn. That is the real man. And when once a man is free to choose what he will, it is this inner imagination of the soul that will dictate destiny to him, good or ill. The true Christian gentleman, then, is not only the man who is honest, upright, and wholesome in his outward life, but the one whose quiet meditations, hidden musings, and secret longing are in harmony with the pure and noble spirit of Jesus Christ. If any who hear me are painfully conscious of falling far below that standard, and are ready to cry out in despair, how can I save myself from the evil imaginations that tempt and torment me from day to day? I bring you the good news of the divine Christ, who once met a man who had an evil spirit, a spirit so vile that it drove him from his home and made him an outcast among the tombs of the dead. And when Christ met this man, he had compassion on him and cast out the evil spirit, and the afterlife of that man was full of peace. It may be so with any man who hears me this day. If you felt an inner sense of longing of, I want to be that man, just as Banks referred to McLaren, this is what I get from the entirety of this book. How I want to be this. It's the same feeling that we get when we read any word of Jesus, any epistle of Paul or James or John when they're writing to the churches. This is what I want to be. I hope that was helpful. Let me know if there's a book you'd like me to read and review. I have a long list, but I don't mind adding a few more. Thanks and have a great day.